Buongiorno. Coming to you from Rome today, and hope your week is going well and that you're well on your way to at least thinking through and completing that first big paper. I look forward to reading your responses when I get back. Yesterday, toured the Vatican museums, and it was extraordinary, overwhelming. Sistine Chapel, truly a feast of human beauty. And so I want to start today with a quote from Antonio Paolucci, who is the director of the Vatican Museums. He writes, "A voyage through the Vatican Museums is not an easy undertaking." And my knees and hips attest to that fact today. It can intimidate and disconcert. Passing from Michelangelo to Assyrian reliefs and Egyptian mummies, from the Etruscan urns to the artifacts of Australian Aboriginals, from the frescoes and tapestries of Raphael to the glassware and ivory carvings of late antiquity, from Byzantine icons to the masterpieces of Matisse, is an arduous endeavor. But such a voyage fully reveals the historic interest, respect, and attention of the Church of Rome for culture, for everything that has come from the hands of man, the artist, the only figure that can bear comparison with God, the Creator. In this sense, the Vatican Museums are the true identifying place of the Catholic Church. As such, they present its history, proclaim its universality, and mark its destiny. So, as we're thinking about the church in Rome and what McCulloch calls Latin Christianity, it's worth reflecting on these claims of the Roman Catholic Church as reflected in art and architecture, and in the habit of collecting the artifacts from a wide range of human cultures. But McCulloch starts with an interesting assertion, this is in chapter 7, that it was unlikely that the Latin Christians would prevail, given the preponderance of the Church of the East. We've already read about the Byzantines, and so we understand that the Roman Christians were hardly the majority. The Orthodox were actually in the minority, those who followed the Council of Chalcedon. And so you had the early Christian centers in the Middle East, Syria, Turkey, North Africa, especially Alexandria, and even onto Asia, and recognize that these churches had the same kind of power struggles that we see later in the Roman Catholic Church as well. The Byzantine era obviously set up a counterpoint or juxtaposition between Christian groups in the battles with Rome, and they were often literal battles. Yet, other centers emerged along the same era, competing with Rome, and more or less with the Byzantines too. So, for instance, Nubian Christians, so-called, in Sudan and Niger, developed the habit that Luther much later developed and picked up on, namely the use of vernacular in worship. And it wasn't until Vatican II in the 1960s that the Roman Catholic Church let go of the universality of Latin as the single unifying language and allowed, encouraged, permitted the use of the vernacular in worship. That's a tidal sea change. And if you want to understand why the Church of Rome became as central as it did, one of the key reasons is because of this emphasis on Latin as the single unifying language, especially in worship. But another center in Georgia and Armenia focused very much around liturgical celebrations and the use of the Trisagion, holy God, holy and strong, holy and immortal. Another center in Ethiopia, we've seen some more of this before, but really an emphasis on the union of God and the monotheism of the Jewish and Christian traditions and the links between them. King Zana, crucial for establishing Christianity in Ethiopia and keeping it strong, with emphasis such as open-air worship, liturgical inclusion of drums, percussion, and strings, and a continual chanting as well, but really focused on Tawahido, this union of humanity and divinity. This notion of Tawahido then gets picked up later in Islam, and as Muslims begin to move into the area. One of the reasons Ethiopia has remained as strong a Christian center is precisely because of this emphasis on Tawahido, which actually dovetails with the Muslim teaching of a similar doctrine. So to chapter 8 then, and the rise of Islam. We'll spend most of our time on chapter 9, as I suggested. That would be the place to focus your reading, since the paper prompt asks you in particular about St. Augustine as sort of the bridge between the classical and the Christian, and then on to the medieval period as well. Very important figure, but no less important was the rise of Islam in a later period. So the chronology is a little cattywampus here in McCulloch, and I'm sure he would admit that as well. But makes the important point, and I think this is accurate and vital to understand, that it was Christian divisions that led to the easy spread of Islam in many of the heartlands of where Christianity was first established: the Middle East, Syria, of course, the Arabian Peninsula, and eventually into the very heart of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople and Turkey, much later. But Muhammad's knowledge of Christian teachings is pretty clear, and that made Islam acceptable as an alternative faith to many people. McCulloch makes the point that forced conversions were not at all the rule, and I think it's vital to lift that up and to recognize that for many people, Islam was not, it was not a huge change to go from being a Miaphysite Christian to being a Muslim. And Muslims, of course, also protected Christians under their rule. In fact, I think it's undoubtedly the case to say that Christians under Muslim rule were treated far better than Muslims and, of course, Jews were under Christian rule. Christianity in Africa appears later in this chapter, again in chapter 8, and again emphasizing the point that it was really Ethiopia that became the center that held out against Islam, and vital to remember on down to today, and that's a place I would love to visit someday as well. Perhaps some of you have been there and could write about your experiences. Finally, then on to chapter 9. McCulloch makes the point that it's unlikely that Rome would be the center of Christianity, to which I reply, maybe. I'm inclined to think that given that Rome was the center of empire and that there was so much monumental architecture dedicated to Rome as an imperial center, it would have been very difficult for Christianity to just leave that heritage unassimilated. And in fact, that's exactly what you see happening, and what my wife Lisa and I have observed over the last 3 days that we've been here, is the continual absorption of the sacred places and times of the pagan heritage into Christian practice. So the sacred places, the temples to the Roman gods, including the place we'll be going this afternoon, Castel St. Angelo, which was built as by Hadrian in the early 2nd century as his own tomb, and then became the tomb of the emperors, who of course were divinized, and then was taken over by the church, and we'll find out on our tour later today exactly when that happened. But time and time again, the sacred places of the various pagan religious traditions were adapted pretty much wholeheartedly, in one piece, with very little exterior change by Christians. So, for instance, the Pantheon is amazing, huge structure, still the world's largest freestanding dome, just stuck in a Rome neighborhood. That was Marcus Agrippa's, the Emperor Marcus Agrippa's temple to all gods, and hence Pantheon. Now has become a Christian church, but with all of the niches still in place, where the statuaries representing the pagan deities would have been, now with mostly statues of the Virgin Mary, to whom the temple is now dedicated. Same thing with sacred times, rebaptizing, so to speak, pagan festivals. That is, of course, why we celebrate Christmas when we do. It was the Roman feast of Saturnalia, the god of the sun, whose portion of whose temple still stands in the Roman Forum, oriented to the east to catch the morning sun, which of course is precisely how most Christian places of worship, if they've been done with an architect who's aware of the history, are oriented. So the Roman Empire established space and time for Christians, evident in art and architecture. McCulloch, again, says it was unlikely that Rome would become the center of enduring Christianity. I think probably was almost inevitable if Christianity wasn't, in fact, going to survive as a movement at all. One of the key factors in this is that under Damasius, the emperors departed Rome. Remember, he divided the empire up into 4 different provinces, and into that void in power, the church moved. This is post-Constantine, of course. And McCulloch's insight about Constantine, I think, is pretty crucial as well. Yesterday in St. Peter's Basilica, we saw the statuary dedicated to Constantine's motto, with a cross front and center, in this we conquer. And McCulloch puts it nicely: war and death seem to have been Constantine's chief motives for interest in the Christian faith, and the building of mortuaries, attention to burial places for the dead, one of Constantine's crucial contributions, and signaling a change, perhaps, in the liturgical center of Christianity as well. The same is true of the emphasis on Peter as the first pope. Historically unlikely, but a claim that demonstrates a continuity and shows how Christianity was as strong and vital and with the same kind of historical integrity and legacy as the old gods. And of course, this goes pretty deep in the tradition, even to Jesus. The designation of Jesus as the Son of God was a title that, of course, had been given to the emperors as well. So this imperial designation, this continual underlay and gradual absorption of empire into Christianity over the course of its first 4 centuries or so. You see this in the value on wealth and status. Take a look, if you get a chance, at Prova's Cento. And had I done things differently in the syllabus, I could very easily have included just a brief excerpt from this, but you can find it online at Early Christian Writings. Prova's Cento, blending Virgil and the life of Jesus. That's kind of a metaphor for what was happening during this entire period. That you have the inclusion of the classical heritage, all of the greats, and Virgil especially, in his poetry, anticipating Christ supposedly in the same way that Tanakh was read by Christians, and now incorporating the classical heritage as well. Same process in the emergence of strong emperors like Ambrose, or strong, Freudian slip there, strong bishops like Ambrose, his ruthlessness in centralizing power and asserting power, including some rather preposterous ways. Take a look at McCulloch's description on pages 300 and following. Pretty amazing contribution by this military figure, now serving as a bishop and taking everything he brought with him from the military into his service to the church. Finally then, St. Augustine, simply a crucial figure. We're all Augustinians in so many ways because of Luther's Augustinian heritage, and all of us are, whether we're Lutheran or not, inherit his insights and build on his emphasis on Scripture and interpretation, and of course his emphasis on grace, which comes directly from Augustine. And that's true, across the Protestant traditions, and by and large true within the Roman Catholic Church now today as well, which is a beautiful thing to be able to acknowledge. That for Augustine, it was the communion of the emperor, but increasingly now it truly is the communion of grace that unites us, because the empire has moved on. And I think recognizing that crucial contextual factor can help us put into relief the way the church was complicit with empire and, in fact, assimilated and incorporated some of the models of imperial power over others. So it was Augustine against the Donatists in particular who bequeathed to us this tradition of just war, compel them to come in, and this emphasis on coercion and compulsion and force as a tool for Christians ever since. That's been a grave temptation to which many Christian leaders have, alas, succumbed. Augustine had complex reasons for developing this just war theory. It wasn't only his encounter with the Donatists and his desire to emphasize the Catholic tradition as opposed to this purist strand with which the Donatists would be associated. But even more, his sense, and McCulloch puts this really quite nicely, the crumbling of the classical world and the disintegration of this idealized union between church and emperor. And so when this Arian heretic, Alaric, sacks Rome in 410, this produced a pastoral crisis for Augustine, first of all, but then also produced a deeper crisis that wasn't resolved for centuries. Namely, how would Christians relate to secular power and to the attempt by various emperors or emperor wannabes to claim Christianity and use Christianity in the assertion of their own imperial ambitions. So we've come a long way from the Prince of Peace and the early Jesus movement among the peasants of Galilee. And it's perhaps good to reflect on that and wrap it up, which is where this assignment for this week comes from, that first paper. And as I indicated in the email I sent to you yesterday, the prompt isn't perfect, and feel free to tweak it, to adjust it. What I really hope you gain through the course of the reading, through the course of our conversations and discussions online, is a lively sense of the changing church and the questions that are still very much alive for us today about how Christians relate to power and how the liturgy in particular, that is, how our gathering together in worship is a continuity for us and can create an alternative to empire, even when compromised by empire and power over others, as the church has often been in its past. So perhaps, and then with a word of grace, monasticism clearly develops as a reaction to this imperial Christianity and a way to preserve the continuity of the Prince of Peace and the teaching of a sacramental identity as the core of who we are as people. That is this unity of God and humanity in creativity through the grace of the Redeemer who is present to us and with and under the power of the Holy Spirit. That's perhaps a good place to end because it is in monasticism and civilization. That is classical civilization, the glories that eventually produce the Renaissance, which I enjoyed seeing the fruits of so much yesterday. Wish you all were here in Rome, and I hope you all have an opportunity. I feel extraordinarily privileged to have been able to make this trip and have truly enjoyed and learned a great deal from it. I'll share some of the pictures with you in a PowerPoint. It'll take a few days probably to get around to that because we're still exploring. 2 more days, we come back Friday. Peace, and I hope this is valuable. Less of a Paulian provocation than a little, what I learned on my October vacation. But peace to you, and good luck with that paper, and I'll see you next week.